Let's bring in the House Majority Whip, Tom Emmer, for more on this. Let me just quickly, Congressman, before we talk about the debt ceiling and the negotiations, or lack thereof, when you look at what's going on the border, what do you think?
Mr. Mayorkas should actually resign. He should do the honorable thing and resign. Absent that, he absolutely should be impeached. He's talking the talk, but literally doing the opposite. That border is open. He wants to blame the previous administration, John. We didn't have this problem under the previous administration. In fact, since Joe Biden took office, since Mr. Mayorkas was in his position, you have more than the population of my state, the state of Minnesota, that's 5.5 million people. If you include the getaways with the actual illegals that we know of, there are over 6 million people.
Yeah, you've got the population of countries like New Zealand or Ireland who have come into the United States.
It's insane.
All right, let's get on to the debt debate. So the meeting was postponed from today to sometime next week. Why?
Well, I think, first off, the White House and the Senate never expected Kevin McCarthy and the House Republicans to do our job. But they should have been paying attention, because Kevin McCarthy and House Republicans are the only ones that have been working in Washington, D.C. since January, passing things like the Parental Bill of Rights, ending the eternal COVID state that we were in, and now passing a debt ceiling approach that is incredibly reasonable. If you're going to raise the debt ceiling, we got to start dealing with the spending problem we have in this country, John, and then we got to deal with the debt. And we've got the solution. The Senate has it now. And I think the problem is the White House is trying to get their hands around what they're going to do next. And it doesn't look like they're moving very fast.
Well, they keep blaming you for not doing anything and precipitating a crisis. The way I see it, Republicans have done something. You came up with this bill and said, here's our plan for raising the debt ceiling. It's just that they don't like it a whole lot. But let me ask you about default, because we're coming up against a deadline. Is there any way that Republicans will allow this country to go into default?
We proved to you that House Republicans are not willing to allow this country to go into default. We have passed the solution. It's reasonable. It puts us on a better path over the next decade. Immediate savings and long-term savings. It literally is going to incent people to get back into the workplace. Able-bodied, working-aged adults without dependents would be encouraged to get back into the workplace if they want to qualify for certain welfare benefits. John, it's eminently reasonable. It is now up to the White House to get this done.
All right, we see the debt clock up there as it races toward $32 trillion. President Biden the other day, up there in New York at the State University of New York in Westchester, looked at the Limit, Save, Grow bill and said, oh, this is full of horrible things. This is what he said.
The Republican bill would put 21 million people at risk of losing Medicaid. The Republican plan would cut federal law enforcement officers 30,000. They would cut 30 million veterans' health care visits. Nationwide, 100,000 teachers and support staff would lose their jobs. 8 million Americans would lose their jobs.
Okay, so that was the list of horribles that he put out there. None of those are in the bill. However, you do cap spending at 2022 levels and then limit it at 1% growth. This is discretionary spending for the next decade. When you limit growth, you're effectively, when you look at it balancing against inflation, cutting something. So what is going to lose money over the next 10 years?
John, first off, you're listening to someone who told us that inflation was transitory. You're listening to someone who told us, don't worry about Afghanistan. We got this thing covered before it was the worst experience for this country that we've seen perhaps since Vietnam. Not a word that this administration, this president say has been truthful, especially on this bill. Let's talk about your question when it comes to the Manchin idea, which is you go back to 22 spending levels. By the way, that's 5 months ago, and the numbers that you're talking about were set by Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. This is not about cuts. This is about savings and trying to take a government that's spending $1.29 for every dollar that we're bringing in right now. And we should point out the revenues that our federal government are collecting are at an all-time high. This is the time where you got to put this thing right side the budget so that you aren't spending more than you're bringing in. And then we got to get to that debt, because if you look at the debt, the CBO has told Republicans and Democrats alike, for the last 80 years, this country's debt service was a little over $9 trillion. If we don't take care of this today, In the next 10 years, our debt service will be at least $10 trillion, and it will overwhelm everything else we expect our government to do, so that we'll be in a place by 2032 where we may have to borrow $200 to $300 billion just to keep this country afloat.
Yeah, I remember the heady closing days of the Clinton administration when they had a plan to pay off the debt. And Gene Sperling told us at that time that the difficult conversations that they were having is, how are we going to allow people to invest in the federal government if we're not selling treasury bonds? They don't have to worry about that anymore.
That's right.
That's for sure. Congressman, good to talk to you. Hope you have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Sandra?
Well,